Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Pond's mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman. And together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You'll find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at doingsofdoyle.com on Blue Sky. Hello and welcome to episode 62. Today, Paul and I are delighted to welcome to the podcast journalist and author Andrew Finkel to talk about his debut novel, The Adventure of the Second Wife. Based for many years in Istanbul, Andrew has corresponded for several international newspapers and media outlets, including the Times, The Economist, Time, CNN, and the New York Times. His articles, editorials, and broadcast commentaries have appeared in an equally wide range of publications, including the Washington Post, the Guardian, and the Spectator. Andrew's experiences of working in the Turkish language press and media prompted him some 10 years ago to co-found Platform 24, a human rights non-governmental organisation that supports independent journalism and free expression. And he's now turned his hand to fiction with The Adventure of the Second Wife, which revolves around the well-documented obsession that Abdülhamid II, the last great Ottoman Sultan, had for the stories of Sherlock Holmes. Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Very nice to be here. Thank you.
And are you joining us today from London or from Istanbul?
Well, I'm back in London, so I'm the home of Sherlock Holmes. I thought it would be much more suitable to be in London.
Very good. So you've had an extensive career in journalism and covered some of the most fascinating developments in modern Turkey, but you've now turned your attention to fiction. So what's the story behind that?
Well, I suppose it was always in the back of my mind that I wanted to write a novel, and I had written film scripts before, and I had come across this line in a book about Constantinople, about Istanbul. It was by a friend and historian, Philip Mansell. It's called Constantinople, City of the Heart's Desire, and it was talking about Abdülhamid, the last, as you said, the last great Ottoman Sultan, or the last Ottoman Sultan to command the world stage. He wasn't the last Sultan. And it was describing the contradictions of his life, that he was conservative and yet modernizing, that he was, this and he was that he was an enigmatic character, and that he would have the Quran read to him, but he would also have the stories of Sherlock Holmes read to him before he went to bed at night. And this struck me as such an extraordinary image, that here was, the caliph, the shadow of God on earth, listening to detective fiction under the bedclothes. So, it's something I wanted to explore. And of course, it allowed me to make sense of the two cultures, the British culture and the Ottoman and the Turkish culture, which were both my adopted cultures. I'm American by birth. So it was in a way of joining these two things and making sense of them all. And of course, setting a story at the end of empire is also very evocative. Abdülhamid he ruled from, 1876? I can't remember exactly, till 1909. So he spanned, he was at the brink of the First World War, and he actually was overthrown, but he lived to see, not quite to see the end of the war, but to see the empire being dismantled. So the end of empire is a very evocative time, and there's many novels like The King and I, or the Passage to India, or whatever, which evoke that period. So I thought Turkey deserved its end of empire novel. Because I didn't realize just how long and how difficult that would be. But it's best not to look before you leap, I think.
And you said then, Abdülhamid is a very contradictory figure, and his legacy is being reinterpreted all the time, particularly in modern Turkey. I mean, that's something that I felt you kind of explore through this novel as well by giving us a slightly different impression of Abdülhamid, who appears as one of the characters.
Well, that's right. I mean, during his lifetime, and of course in Europe, he was vilified. He was Abdul the
Mm.
Damned. He was the Red Sultan. He was, whether this was fair or not, he was the author of the Bulgarian massacres. Gladstone, vilified and hated him, and yet others regarded him as being essential to preserving, the empire and defending against Russia and preventing Russia from invading India. So he was, even at the time, he was a controversial figure. But even as I was writing the book, his reputation changed. Here was the man who was responsible for the end of empire, and then he had suddenly turned into a nationalist hero in contemporary Turkey. That he was, someone who defended Ottoman Turkish integrity against outside powers, and he had been unnecessarily vilified, and he was this great hero, and yet. At the same time, he was, very autocratic. He was responsible for incredible, many of the things we dislike about Turkey today, the lack of freedoms. He was also responsible for those. So, in my mind, I tried to make sense of him as just this sort of human being, and what could be more human or frail than having a penchant for Sherlock Holmes.
Indeed.
So that was. I tried to preserve that ambiguity, I guess.
As you got more into this, Andrew, and after being inspired by this kind of parenthetic aside in Philip Mansell's book, did you know much about the world of Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle, or did it just kind of that line just caught your mind and you thought that you would go off and to look up the Sherlock Holmes and Doyle material, or were you familiar to begin with to any sort of extent?
Well, that's a very good question. I have to say that I discovered, of course, I had read a few stories when I was a kid, and the Red Haired League, or Scandal in Bohemia, or all the stories which are immediately attractive, and in which the character of Sherlock Holmes emerges full blown and is so fascinating. But I was never a great fan, and as I began to sort of investigate this thing, I discovered that there were people who were really quite, into Sherlock Holmes, and then the internet was, chock a block with Sherlock Holmes. Well, I won't call them fanatics, but
I think that would be acceptable.
People who were certainly obsessed by Sherlock Holmes, and so I spent, a very long time being obsessed by people who were obsessed. And I suppose at the end of the day, I fell down the rabbit hole myself, and I still am slightly ambivalent towards the stories of Sherlock Holmes. I pretend not to like them all, I decide the later ones aren't much good, and the mysteries are, but when all is said and done, I guess I've fallen into the trap like everyone else,
Once he's got his clutches on you.
Yeah, I know, suddenly I became, well, if I can tell his story, I mean, at a certain point, I mean, there was a moment when I was commanded from on high to sort of to write this book and to finish this book, and it happened. An element in my plot is that, I needn't tell you, in the 1893 December issue of the Strand magazine, Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty tumble off the a cliff over the Reichenbach Fall, and aren't heard of again until Conan Doyle's accountant said, "You better bring it back. We need the cash." And so there's the death of Sherlock Holmes, which was felt all over England. The princess, I'm not going to lecture you people on this. The Prince of Wales wore an armband of mourning. So I hadn't read that story, The Final Adventure, and I thought, well, what I would do is I'll go down and I'll find a copy of the original Strand magazine, the sort of dusty, unbound version of the Strand, and just get the sense of what it would have been like in those days to read it in the original. So I went down to, in those days, Marylebone Public Library. There still was a Marylebone Public Library, and there was a Conan Doyle collection, Sherlock Holmes collection in the basement. And this, for those who don't know, I'm sure there's probably but none of your listeners, everyone knows, I'm sure, is that this was the borough of Marylebone's contribution to the Festival of Britain, because Baker Street is just around the corner. So I went there, and there was this very nice, helpful librarian. Her name was Catherine Cook, and she's turned out to be I later discovered, the head of the Sherlock Holmes Society. And there I was trying to show off that I knew as much as anyone. So I asked for a copy of Finlay Christ's book, and she looked at me and she said, I think it's pronounced Christ. And anyway, she was very helpful, and she gave me a copy of the Strand, and I read The Death of Sherlock Holmes, and the Death of Sherlock Holmes is on the left-hand side on the verso, and on the other side was a portrait of Abdülhamid. And suddenly, what I thought was I was inventing this story, and suddenly this story was inventing me. This again, it was another parenthetical. This was an article about Abdülhamid written by this very interesting Muslim India from Pune, who had been at the Inns of Court, was a confidant of Queen Victoria. He was the sort of mentor of the Munshi, the famous Indian manservant of Victoria. Obviously, a very clever and erudite man who was writing this panegyric in favor of Abdülhamid to get sort of Britain, to get his readers on side, because the British England's support for the Ottoman Empire was essential to stop India from invading India, and his whole purpose in life was to defend the Islamic community in South Asia, in India, he's again at the very end of this article, he, in parentheses, it's another parentheses that altered my life, was he talks about this exhibition in Olympia in which and I later became engaged in this. In 1893, the same year as Sherlock Holmes falls to his death, the same month, in Olympia in West London, they opened a replica of Constantinople. They constructed an entire city within what was then the largest enclosed space in the UK, in England, which was a model of Constantinople. And twice a day, on a stage the size of a professional football pitch, 2,000 performers would perform this mad sort of musical dance spectacle, complete with, a lake and boats and camels and God knows what. And there were 12,000 spectators at each performance twice a day. And so, that's if you do the math, and it went on for virtually a whole year. So, let's say it wasn't a full house every night, but 5 or 6 million people must have seen this thing. And it must have completely transformed the way that British people conceived of the Ottoman Empire. And I ask anyone, and I don't think anyone has ever heard of this thing. So it's really quite an extraordinary thing. So this sort of imaginary city in West London becomes the setting, partially the setting for my book as well.
I was, and it's probably worth us saying at this point, or just giving a quick summary of how these themes come together: Istanbul, Sherlock Holmes, Abdülhamid II. So, for the benefit of those who haven't read the book, can you give us a quick, what's the premise?
Okay, well, there's two premises, or premi, I guess. I don't know what the plural is. And there's the one I started which was that Abdülhamid loved Sherlock Holmes and would have the stories read to him. And he was, like many of your listeners, a fan. And would have the stories translated and collected. And then the second premise was one, which may not be true, which was that Arthur Conan Doyle, on his, near the end of his life, was asked which of the Sherlock Holmes stories he liked the best. And he said, well, of course, I hated them all because, no one remembers me for my serious work. But there is one story which continues to obsess me, and that is The Adventure of the Second Wife. But there is no adventure of the second wife. But what there is a Sherlock Holmes community which is plays the game, follows every single way. And so for them, of course, or for us now, I guess now I've become a member, this was the mystery, And so what did Arthur Conan Doyle mean by the adventure of the second wife? And of course, it falls to our main protagonist, who just happens to be a doctor and just happens to live in Baker Street, and just, he's ear, nose, and throat. And he, by coincidence, or possibly not coincidence, he's called John Watson, to find a vital clue to solve this mystery. And he gets involved in this great adventure to solve this mystery. And of course, he does end up solving it, but of course, it also completely upends his life, But I mean, there are, of course, the untold stories, of which this is one. The famous one. The one I like the best is the arrest of Wilson, the notorious canary trainer. But everyone knows about the giant rat of Sumatra. But how many of you know about Recoletti, or the club foot in his abominable wife?
Fantastic.
So there's to these untold mysteries, we had The Adventure of the Second Wife.
Yeah. Well, and as you say, that kind of puzzle is catnip to the Sherlockian community. We that's the sort of thing we would latch onto straight away to investigate. I think the summary that you give there really just sort of underscores that this is a very multi-layered novel. You have multiple narrators, you have exhibits within it, so you're changing narrator and voice all the way through. And there are multiple mysteries, aren't they? They're sort of nested within each other, sort of Russian doll. It strikes me that it must have been quite complicated to write, but maybe that's my failing as a that's why I don't write fiction. But was it a difficult process?
Yes. Yes, I think you got it. You got it the first time. Yes, it was complicated and it was difficult, and it did take time. And at some points, I wasn't quite sure how to solve the mysteries. And I guess it's like any. I mean, what I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was surprised, is that I had sort of plotted out, the way one should and does, the story and the novel, and then I had these characters, and then at one point, John Watson, my principal narrator, really couldn't have told the story the way I wanted to. So I brought in another narrator who was, in fact, the Sherlockian figure, who's this Turkish, very eccentric woman, Turkish professor who, has all the annoying habits that Sherlock Holmes has, and a few more. And suddenly she started narrating the story, and she took the story somewhere where I had absolutely no idea why she did this or where she was taking it. And I could have torn up the chapter, but I thought, well, she knows what she's doing. So she took this story off in a different direction, which was really quite odd. And I sort of had to follow that. And again, if I could tell another story, when the book was actually finished and it was being, edited and proofread and this and that, the other, this was partly during the pandemic, and of course everything had to be done, remotely and by email or by whatever. And the publisher, unlike many publishing houses these days, was very careful and did a very careful proof, sub-edit, and they were just really great about producing the book, which is a very the book itself is really quite handsome. It's,
Yes, very
I think,
beautiful.
Very.
I mean, even if you didn't actually read the damn thing, it's actually worth having just to hold and to fondle. Anyway, she was. I was having these correspondence with the sub editor, and I could see at the very beginning she wasn't really into it, and then as we were getting on, I could see she became more and more enthusiastic about the book, and by the end she really liked it. But there were certain sort of moments when I didn't quite, for example, is it the one of the Sherlock Holmes volumes, I'm trying to remember which one, has 11 stories in America, but only 10 stories in the UK
Yeah, the
edition.
memoirs. Yeah.
The memoirs. Well, you
Yeah.
knew this, but I didn't know this, but she knew this, and she said, "Oh, well, it's got 11 American 10," and I thought, well, that's sort of
Mm.
unusual to have a sub-editor who would know that, or very incredibly professional of her to look this up. And then at a certain point, I refer to Conan Doyle's house in South London, and in the marginalia she wrote, "It's for sale." And she sent me a link there was a forced more, it was the bank had foreclosed and they were selling off the house. And I thought, how does she know this? And so I looked her up, and of course she was one of these, she'd written this book called Sherlock Holmes's London,
there you go.
and so she suddenly, all these, coincidences, or and of course I remember writing it at some point. I got back in touch many years later with Catherine Cook and read her about all these coincidences, and Catherine Cook said, "Well, I'm not at all surprised. These things happen in the world of Sherlock Holmes. It's so I found myself, it was bigger than I was, the whole thing."
Yeah.
Well, the whole thing is fascinating, the way with history and fiction, and the crossovers and the intertwining, which is obviously at the heart of your book. And I while I was reading it, I actually did get swept up, and one of my hobby horses is certainly Ottoman history.
Oh, really?
And there's a lot of this. Yeah, is this real? Is it? You begin to doubt,
Yes,
and you begin to believe in the existence of the second wife manuscript, and it's just fascinating the way that these things work, and it sort of ties into what you're saying there with coincidences, that it makes you doubt in the right sort of way what's real, what's fictional. I just found that so enjoyable,
Mm.
and it just really just carries you along. And did you, as you're writing it, do you begin to doubt and get swept up in your own world almost?
Well, that's I could ask for a higher praise than what you've just issued. I suppose I set out on the premise that even if it weren't real, it could have happened, that it could have been real, that I wasn't going to sort of suddenly have, Martians come from outer space and pluck people up. I mean, there is a supernatural element to bits of it, but in such a way as that you're not sure if they're supernatural or not. I mean that Conan Doyle believed in ghosts, of course, and the afterworld, and it's there, but it's not there. I'm married to a very eminent Ottoman historian, and so I couldn't really create an Ottoman world that was completely bogus.
Leave that to Olympia.
I couldn't. Well, I couldn't face her at dinner if that were the case. I tried to. I suppose one of the things is, as I said, I'm neither British nor Turkish, and as you say, what a novel should do, or my image of a novel is that it creates a world in which it creates its own world, and it's a world you want to stay in, and you struggle to leave because it's you're there voluntarily, but it's something that holds on to you and hangs on to your imagination, and Of course, I don't have that world because I'm a professional outsider. I used to write in the Turkish language press, but I would do so as as this whimsical character who didn't really who wasn't Turkish and was trying to make sense of these things that all my
Mm.
readers knew 100 times better than I did. But and the fact of me trying to make sense of it was holding on to their which was the hook,
Mm,
the
Mm.
thing that was attractive to them.
mm,
So in order to create a world that was mine, I had to go
Mm.
into the past, because
mm.
who knows about what it was really like to be in the
Mm.
90s. So the idea was that I felt on safer grounds going into a world which none of my readers knew, or
Yes.
perhaps you do because
Mhm.
you're interested in Ottoman history, but which very few people knew.
Mm,
And that way I sort of felt safer, and I could sort of make my own ground rules, as it were. I mean, I did spend a lot of time trying to make it feel authentic,
Mm.
and of course, being married to Ottoman history,
yes.
our friends are also Ottoman historians, so I
Mhm.
was incredibly lucky that the world's foremost authority on Abdülhamid. I went with him around Abdülhamid's
Wow.
palace,
Oh,
and he
wonderful.
showed
Mhm.
me this and showed me that, and and I could. I mean, one of the themes in the book, it's is that Abdülhamid was very self-conscious about his image and about
Mm.
how he was perceived by the outside world, and of
Mm.
course, this is absolutely true. And one of our very good friends has written this book, which explores this,
Mm.
but and he even mentions this Olympia thing, but he's not
Mm.
really aware of it in the book, and
Mm,
he sort of finds some
Mm.
reference to it in the archives about how, in the Ottoman archives, about how appalled that they were that they wanted to import,
yeah.
supernumeraries for some London performance, but he didn't know what
Mm.
the performance was. It's not referred
Mm.
to in his book, but
Mhm.
I was able to sort of present him with the flip
Mm.
side of
Yeah.
what he was writing about.
Mm.
And again, there's two or three brilliant Ottoman historians who,
Mm.
if ever I had a question, I would sort of send them off, and one of them, would always reply by return of email. So,
Mm.
so,
Wonderful.
so I was very lucky in that sense, and
Yeah.
my acknowledgements are probably longer than the book. I have 2 or 3 pages of acknowledgements at
Mm.
the end, of people who really saw me through this process.
Well, it's interesting. Is I mean, truth is often so much stranger than fiction,
Mm.
and I thought that Istanbul really came out as a character in your
Mm.
book. And one of the things that Sherlockians will often say about the Hound of the Baskervilles is that Dartmoor is another character in the book. It has a personality of its own. And as somebody who's never visited Istanbul, it just whetted my appetite to go and experience it, really.
Mm.
Because as you say, you jump. One of the other things that's very nice about the book, I think, is that you're jumping time periods. So you have in the 1860s, and then you have the family stories that predate that, and then you have the 1960s. So we get to experience Istanbul in
Mm.
different time periods as well.
Well, again, that's the second major compliment you've given me, which I'm very pleased to accept. I mean, yeah, I mean the thing is, I first came to Istanbul as a kid. I came there in the '60s, and I went to school there for a year, and then I kept going back, and I taught there at a university, and until and then I went back again as a journalist. So when I first came to Istanbul, it was a city of 2 million people.
Mm,
And now it's a city of 16 million people.
amazing.
So it's this city which, you changes before your eyes.
Mm,
You think you know it, but of course you can't know it.
Mhm.
And it is elusive. And I try and capture that sense of, elusiveness in it. Um, but there's this, again, if I can tell this is a slightly self-congratulatory anecdote. Well, perhaps they all are. I don't know. Um, 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 there's now in a very prominent art gallery in Istanbul at this very moment. There's an exhibition of Istanbul and the literary imagination. And it starts in the 17th century with some French epic poem or something. And, of course, this was, Orlando changed sex in Istanbul. And there's the Maltese Falcon was, that it came from Constantinople and from Russia with Love, of course, is the classic one. But there's it looms very large in the literary imagination as either this place of mystery or of confusion or of all sorts of things. And my book is it's in a display cabinet in an art gallery. Maybe it's better in a display cabinet than on the bedside table. I don't know, so I'm quite flattered that I'm the last entry in the catalog.
Wow, there you go.
So that's so it was very much and the person who compiled the catalog was very, again, like you, complimentary about the way that that there was this very real sense of the city that I knew and have grown up in, and I mean you can tell of books which are set in a place but don't really know the place,
Yes, you can.
and a place where you don't have to tell what's going on because it's so in your bones that you can't help but give the feel of the city because that's all you know.
Yeah.
So I hope I'm in the latter category.
Yeah, and on that topic there of merging sort of fact and fiction, another thing that was like you, Paul. There were moments in the book I was having to challenge my own thinking and go, did this really happen? Was this intriguing question of whether or not Conan Doyle had met Abdülhamid II, because he was there, but we're not entirely sure, are we?
Well, it is. I mean, it's quite a vexing. It's a little mystery in its own right, which I haven't solved because Conan Doyle did go to Constantinople, and he went there on his second honeymoon. He too had a second wife. I mean, pretty much. I sort of once tallied the figure. There's the adventure of the second wife, which is a story told, and there's a second wife in the adventure of the second wife. But there's about 10 other second wives in the book, including Conan Doyle's. And they did go to Istanbul. I think it was. Well, what year was it? 1906 or something? I can't remember. In which he went on a second honeymoon, and Abdülhamid presented both his wife and himself with these very fancy medals. The Order of Compassion was the one his wife got, and he was given another one. But in his own memoirs, he says, we would have met with the Sultan, but it was Ramadan, so he couldn't meet with us. And yet there's another set of memoirs by, I can't remember his name now, Woods, but one of these military advisors, an English military advisors, Woodpush, I think he was called. And he said, oh, yes, they did meet. So whether they met and they was, and then there's this very sort of bizarre novel written after Abdülhamid was deposed, in which talks about it's written by this man who hates Abdülhamid. He's Armenian, and he has every reason to hate him. And he writes this 900-page novel called Abdülhamid and Sherlock Holmes, in which at one point Conan Doyle is going to Constantinople in 1904 or something, which he didn't do, but this is completely fictitious. And he says that they were about to meet, and then Abdülhamid learned that Conan Doyle was only going to the palace in order to investigate it for us, to do research for another story. So he canceled the meeting, and then he summons this other detective, this Scottish detective called, I can't remember his name now, Grant or something, who to solve this mystery. And when the detective gets there, he changes sides, and instead of helping Abdülhamid, he sort of tries to, he joins the opposition, as it were, because he's so appalled by what he sees. But there is a famous incident in the book where Abdülhamid is strolling the grounds, shoots his is testing this Italian rifle which he's just got, and he shoots in the air, and a pigeon falls. It's got a message tied to it, which is plays a key part in a role in the mystery. But that doesn't appear in my book. I have to say. Maybe the sequel. Who knows?
Maybe the sequel. That's right. But you do have lots of interesting asides about coming back to Abdülhamid. You show him more in a kind of domestic setting, and without giving the book away, the opening, the book is bookended by a lovely scene with the jailer, and you got a sense there of almost like a domestic side. It's a slightly different side to Abdülhamid than you might have got. I'm thinking about Barry Unsworth. He wrote a book, I seem to remember, in the 80s, but I seem to remember that was much more in the Red Sultan vein.
It was. Yeah, what's it called? We're Vultures. I can't remember.
Fury of Vultures or something.
Something of that. Which Abdülhamid is like this, like Mr. Tooth Decay. He's like this evil, this evil character who's oversees the torture of his opponents. Yes. No. I mean, the thing is, as you again. There's that incident in which Abdülhamid is deposed and he's under house arrest in one of his palaces, and a jailer comes. He finds himself in the same room as one of his jailers, and I tell that story 3 different times in three different ways, and I think the idea is, I mean, there's a line in the book about how that historians are no better than paparazzi in abandoning their subjects once the power is gone, and so I guess I am much more than I thought I would be empathetic towards Abdülhamid, one of the ways of doing this is that there are scenes in which he's still on the throne, but the scenes that are most powerful perhaps are the ones when he's been overthrown and he's in exile and he's no longer in power, and that somehow he's much more human in that setting than he would be. I mean, there is a curious thing which was reported in the New York Times, and this is real. Is that during the book he was taken into exile, and he was taken to Thessaloniki in this famous mansion, and then the Balkan Wars started, and the Young Turks who had overthrown him were they were very insistent that he not be captured by the opposing armies, and one of the reasons might have been that they would have used him to regain the city and to have some sort of legitimacy. So they were very keen to evacuate him ahead of the armies, which they did by 48 hours or something like that on a German ship, and they came for him, and the very first thing he asked his the people who were bringing him back to Istanbul was, is Conan Doyle still writing Sherlock Holmes stories? And the New York Times reported this as, at first I thought he was demented, but then he sort of had this perfectly civilized conversation in French about Sherlock Holmes, which proved that he was quite sane. And then there was the other story when he was actually being deposed and waiting for the delegation that would turf him off the throne in his palace. By some accounts, he spent it reading the Bruce Parkington affair. That he as he was waiting to be taken off the throne, he was reading Sherlock Holmes. But Sherlock Holmes did play an important part in his life.
Yeah,
but unfortunately, he didn't live long enough to read The Blanched Soldier, where we hear about Sherlock Holmes actually being commissioned by the Sultan. And we unfortunately we don't know exactly what the mission was, but it's
this is another one of these untold tales. Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. The Blanched Soldier is. I took some heart from that because that's the one of 2 stories which is narrated by Holmes himself, and Watson actually I don't think actually even appears in the story, except. He's referred to, Holmes talks about him in a rather rude way, but he doesn't actually appear. And I guess that sort of gave me some self-confidence in having more than one narrator in my book.
Well, one of your narration, one
Mm.
of your narrators is actually the Doylean John Watson, because there is a small element of pastiche within, but this is not a pastiche. We should say to people, this is, if you're expecting a pastiche, this is not the book for you. But you do have an element of John Watson's account, as it were, within the story as well. Did you struggle to get into the tone of voice for that, or did you have to work at that? I mean, that's a
I had to work at it, but I have to say it wasn't a struggle. I really rather enjoyed it. And I think maybe, again, this is another example of my hypocrisy is that, I'm not really a Sherlockian. I don't, except that I spent 20 years, sort of researching. I don't really like pastiches, even though I wrote one that sort of intertwines through the book. But I mean, the thing about, in a curious way, pastiches can be too easy to write. I mean, they're sort of, well, bad ones anyway. And you feel very clever because I wrote this pastiche of, Conan Doyle, and it sounds just like Conan Doyle, except it doesn't, and I didn't want to fall into that trap. So, but I did, The Adventure of the Second Wife is actually a story. So I did need to write the story, but what I did is I cut it up into bits.
Yeah.
So you never really, you get the overall sense of what the story is, but you don't sort of read it from A to B, A to Z, and read it, and it sort of reflects on what's going on in the real book, as it were.
Yeah. You've also got what I think is a very clever way of getting around this as well, is we don't actually know who's written this story. And there's elements it's translated, so you don't have to get the authentic voice there. It's so many layers going on again that this is not straightforward pastiche. This is a very different approach, and it's a way of a really good way of getting around having to do that, or capturing that authentic voice, which, as you've said, very few pasticheurs actually do, and it works beautifully here because we're getting, as the reader, we're getting. Our minds are being played with here. What am I reading? Who's writing this? And it just works beautifully obviously within the context of the novel.
Well, thank you for putting it that way. I did try, and what I did do is try again on the principle that not everything was real, but could have been real. I didn't want to use words that were anachronistic, that Conan Doyle wouldn't have used, and it doesn't seem to exist anymore. But there was. Back when I was writing it, there was a online concordance by something called Mr. Moon or something like that, which had basically the complete works of Conan Doyle online. So you could, if you were using a word and you think, well, would Conan Doyle ever use that word? You could look it up and see. So I did spend a huge amount of time making sure that the language, I mean, the worst thing you can do is sort of use the sort of mock Victorianian, sort of, and that just sort of just irritating because the language. I mean, you know better than I do. The language that Conan Doyle is very real and actual and conversational and very immediate. There's nothing affected or jarring about it, and to make sure that it's not jarring it takes a little bit of effort. But it was fun. It was fun to do. I have to say. Those were bits of that I quite enjoyed, and I suppose I did fall into the trap of feeling I was quite clever, sort of, you parodying how Conan Doyle would have said something, and there is a certain amount of fun and I think for those who know the canon, as it were, I think there's a few sort of bonbons for them. I think
Yeah, well, there's a lot of. I was going to say there are a lot of Easter eggs in this for Sherlockians. Right from the first meeting of John Watson and Layla in a pub called Stanford. You're setting out your stall pretty early in terms of those internal references, and I just wondered what your take was on the Sherlockian world now, because you as you said, you're not a Sherlockian as such, but you're being slowly indoctrinated or pulled into this world. This is a book about obsession in many ways, and the course obsession there is the Sherlock Holmes one. So, what do you make of it?
Well, yes, it's again, this is like the sort of book, the aftermath, the aftershock, the tsunami after having written the book. Again, I got back in touch with Catherine Cook, who had helped me so much, and she did a sort of a small review in the journal,
Mm.
and um, and then I found myself being invited to give the after dinner speech at the annual Sherlock Holmes dinner. That really, I can't tell you how big my head was after that, how conceited I became as a result of that. And I didn't actually hire a skywriter to write, to tell all of West London that I was doing this, but I did feel immensely honored and pleased, and of course everyone was so. Well, they seem normal.
Well, I think there was a lovely
Mm.
line that I wrote down in your book where you described Sherlockians as the grandmasters of the pointless digression, which I think I'm going to have put on a t-shirt now. But you also you depict a. I mean, I think your Sherlockian world is slightly more organized and
Mm.
disciplined than than the actual world. But the one of the things I thought was really fascinating, I don't know if you know, but you've got a central plot point in your story is that there is Snake is the name for this organization, which is a group of science societies coming together.
Yeah, because
And
it makes a
the
sound like
sound, yeah.
like a snake. Yes.
That's right. Well, earlier this year, there was, in fact, one of those meetings took place. A group of science societies in North America actually got together. So this is now an example of life imitating art, I think.
Well, as I said, not everything did happen, but it could have happened. So
And you may well.
and of course it's such a sort of fun thing, it's a fun place to have your imagination let rip in these societies which are competing with each other, and you want to be the first to sort of reveal this to the world, and
Yeah.
the sort of I make it much nastier than it is. As I said, I was so impressed at how nice everyone was, and nice to me anyway. I came back from Japan where I had lunch in the Sherlock Holmes pub with some
Mhm.
members of the Sherlock Holmes Club of Japan, and they couldn't have been more pleasant or nicer or battier.
Yeah. Well, that pretty much sums up the Sherlockian world, I think. Nice and
Yeah,
batty.
yeah.
I think the other thing to step in with here is as well is the fact that it's great in your book that to have the acknowledgement of Doyle
Mm.
as well. There's so much Sherlockian stuff which kind of, as you know, with the game, Doyle is essentially just the literary agent. So
Mm.
it's nice here to have Doyle acknowledged as the writer, and Doyle having these connections to Abdülhamid, whether they're real or not, that he's there and he is the creator, that he's not been sidelined, and it's always good to see that acknowledgement, because there is this overshadowing of Doyle for so long, and it's great to see him in whatever form coming forward again.
Well, again, I hadn't thought of that, but yes, that is that. Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out, and
Mm,
and I guess it's the idea of, well, of course, in Doyle's case, it was the characters took over his life and he
mm,
resented them,
mm.
but there is a sense that the characters, if you've succeeded in creating, good characters, that they
Mm,
have a life and momentum of their own, but it
mhm.
doesn't mean that you didn't create them,
No.
Mm.
and so I think. Yeah, and of course there were parodies at the time of his,
Mm,
during his lifetime
mm,
as well. I mean, and there were ones in Turkish,
Yes.
yes.
and so even at the time. So if you create a rich world,
Mm,
then it's yours, but it's not yours.
mm, mm.
That's a
Mm.
good point. Yeah.
And as you say, all starts to kind of the worlds melding into one another, and this whole thing with what you've found in the Strand, where you talk about the Ottoman extravaganza in Olympia and so on, and
Mm.
this Rafiuddin Ahmad
Mm.
character is absolutely fascinating. And as soon as I read the book, back to the back issues of the Strand and looking at these articles and the fascinating one that he wrote, about Queen Victoria and learning Urdu. And
Yeah.
and did I mean obviously you got caught up with this character and did you find him easy to research? Because I'd really like to know a lot more about him.
I didn't, and
Mm,
again, as you say, he was this. I mean, he's a real person.
mm,
Um, Far more interesting than possibly I'd made him out to be. But um, I, at some stage during this, I went to India to visit a friend, and she taught at a university, the Jalalabad University, and no, sorry, not
mm,
Jalalabad. Anyway, it was, and I looked in the library there, and there was a book in Urdu about
mm,
called the Distinguished Muslims of Pune,
mm,
and they had a chapter on him. But of course, it was
mm,
in Urdu, and
mm,
I don't know Urdu, and I hired one of her students to translate it for me, which I'll happy to send you the chapter.
I'd be
Um,
fascinated.
and he was just an incredibly interesting man.
Mm,
He was born in South Asia. He came to India. He was obviously part of this very educated and esoteric community
mm,
in London, I mean, the interesting thing about this Olympia thing is that I'm not sure, but I feel it in my bones that the fact that this Constantinople existed in West London,
mm,
it became the sort of nucleus of a expatriate
Yeah, an
mm,
expat community.
Muslim community.
mm,
So Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan,
mm,
he lives 3 minutes from Olympia.
mm.
Ah,
The blue plaque
Gosh.
commemorating where his life is three, is there, and he came here
Hmm.
he came to London in 1893, I think.
Mm,
Anyway, he lived there during while this exhibition was going on,
gosh.
and I came across I've written the article I can send to you, which was
Mm,
about there's this famous, not I don't know if he's famous or not, this Turkish intellectual who grew up in the time of Abdülhamid, a very pious man who became a lecturer in Turkish in Cambridge,
mm,
or the first person to teach Turkish in Cambridge. But he came to England without knowing any English at all, fled the Abdülhamid because he thought he was going to be, he had a bone to pick with Abdülhamid. It was
mm,
very much because Abdülhamid had seized his family's property, or the
mm.
state had seized
mm,
the property, and that it was more than that. But anyway, he got himself out of Constantinople smuggled aboard a steamer because you couldn't leave the country
mm,
without permission. A British steamer going to Hull. So he goes to Hull, and he writes about how horrible the food was. There was some bacon and all this horrible food that he gets to Hull, and he doesn't know what to do, and he's befriended by the family, the captain's family, and the wife puts him on a train to London, from Hull,
mm,
and where does he go? He goes to Olympia because
mm.
that's
Yeah.
he knows about. He doesn't know
Gosh.
any
Wow.
English, but he knows about Olympia, and he because he ends not up in Kensington but in Kennington,
Mm,
and then finally he finds his way to Kensington, and he meets some guy and he finds a boarding house
mm,
because it's this guy helps him out, and so it obviously
mm,
played a much larger, it did play a role, and it's interesting to know what that might have been.
That's an
mm.
So so
amazing
so
Yeah.
story.
so so I have tried to follow that particular,
Mm, mm,
no, hornets. Well, I don't know what the expression is, but digression, but
mm,
it's quite difficult to know about where to go. I mean, as for
mm,
Rafiuddin Ahmed, he went back to India, became the Minister of Education, and the
mm,
Pune government was knighted.
mm,
And then there was a line in this chapter, this biography, how he was poisoned
mm,
by a rival, and he was blinded.
mm.
because of this poison. Um, and he lived. I think he was 90. He
Gosh.
died in the 50s, in the
Hmm.
1950s.
Oh.
So, I think he died, I was born in 53. I don't know when he
Mm.
was. I think he died. Anyway, we overlapped.
Yes.
Yeah, amazing.
Mm.
So,
Incredible.
it is incredible.
It is amazing that. And so is this giving us a hint as to what you might be working on next?
No. No, I've got an idea of setting a story in the 1950s,
Mm.
during the Cold War. Um,
Mm.
Wonderful.
but we'll see.
Well, look, it's been brilliant to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today, Andrew. And
Mm.
congratulations on The Adventure of the Second Wife. We
Yeah,
both really
absolutely.
enjoyed it.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much for
Mm.
for having me and being so enthusiastic about the book. That's great.
Lovely to see you.
Great to see you, Andrew. Thank you.
Take care. Take care.
Well, thanks again to Andrew for joining us today. That was a really fascinating discussion. And we covered a lot of ground there, Paul, didn't we?
Oh, absolutely. As does the book.
Mm,
The history and fiction intertwining, as we've said, and um, some wonderful, very different sort of game playing with Sherlock Holmes going on in this book. And I'd recommend The Adventure of the Second Wife as a great novel.
mm.
Um, don't go to it expecting a Sherlock Holmes story,
No,
because
no.
it's about a Sherlock Holmes story, but it isn't a Sherlock Holmes story itself. But there's lots of Sherlock Holmes in it. So yeah, go to it with an open mind, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. It's great.
Yeah, and I would definitely say having just read it the second time,
Mm.
it's definitely a book that rewards rereading because there are so many connections in it and it works
Mm.
on multiple levels.
Yeah.
And I confess that I missed some of those on the
Mm.
first reading. It's a very rich book, and I think
Mm.
it rewards that revisit. So that's it for this month. If you've enjoyed the podcast, you can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com, and we'll be hosting the show notes there. And you can also find out how to become a supporter on Patreon or PayPal. And Paul, what are we looking at next month?
Next month, back to a more standard format. We'll be looking at the short story "The Man from Archangel," which is a rather wonderful, gloomy story set on the windswept Scottish coast.
Great. So until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye.